All right, so this is the my process on how to optimizing the Flask scan. Now this model is a little bit trickier and it has a lot more issues with it that take up a little bit more time, but for the most part, if you're able to do this successfully, then you should be able to handle most of the models, if not all models. So I have ZBrush open up here. I'm going to double click my Dynamic Sphere project. I notice symmetry mode is on. I'm going to hit X to toggle that off. And I'm going to import my Flask model. Right here, Flask scan. There's my original OBJ. Now, one thing I notice here that it's almost oriented right. And all I want to do is rotate this so it's like lying flat on the ground. And I want to get it as close as possible like that. Let's see, good. And maybe it's a little bit tilted this way, go like that. Great, so that's looking good. And restore orientation, go back to my draw tool. Now, a couple of things with this model. We have a platform that's melted into the model. And what we want to do is cut away this part and then fill up the hole that we're going to cut away. So before we do that, I'm going to actually decimate it first so we have less polygons to deal with on the bottom here. So I'm going to duplicate this model, uncheck the eyeball, and then I'm going to go to Z plugin. I'm going to make sure that keep UVs is toggled on. It should be orange, and then I'm going to hit preprocess current. And I have all these buttons saved up here. There we go. It might take a bit. It's just trending along. Great. So once that's done, I'm going to hover over my model, and it looks like it's about 1 million polygons. We can definitely lower that down. In this case, since it's a fairly simple object, I'm going to try 15% of decimation. I'm going to decimate current. There you go. I'm going to hover over this, what it looks like. It's about 150,000 now. And it looks to be pretty good that we can use, but I have a feeling we could lower the quality just a little bit. Okay, that's looking a little bit more simple. I'm gonna hover over here and where we're at. Now we're at about 100,000. So I think that is a good number for this particular model. And again, it depends on what model that you have. Usually we stick to 17 or 20% because that's good enough. But because this model has a lot more cleanup to do, we do want to get it as low as possible. So it's reduced now and I lost my texture. So all I can do is just import my original texture, which is here. I'm going to open it up, import it. I'm going to load it in like this. I'm going to flip B, that's important, and I'm going to load the texture in. Okay, and again, how to load the texture is in texture map and then loading that in there. I'm looking at the texture. Texture looks good. It's properly mapped in. Now we need to deal with this area to crop. And don't worry if you make a mistake because we have an original there. And at this point, I can duplicate it, but quite confident that I can just crop away this. So there are a couple ways we can crop it away, like I said before. First thing I'm going to do is actually go, while holding Control-Shift, I'm going to click on this selection tool, and there's a select lasso. That's the same thing as a select rectangle, except it's a lasso. So it will give me a little bit more flexibility when I hold Control-Shift, and I can actually trace fairly close to what I want to cut off. And it's going to isolate that, and I'm going to invert that selection, right? And then delete hidden, and I'm going to go on the other side of the model right here. Right there. I want to be careful that I don't cut off the other side without looking at it. So I'm going to go like this. Invert it and delete hidden. And then this last bit here, I'm going to get rid of. And group selection, delete hidden. Okay, so I'm going to rotate around because sometimes we can miss. Yep, so we can see that there was this hidden plane underneath that I can get. If I snap my view, I'm going to get this, and I know there's a little bit there that I missed here. So now we have that selected, which is good. Invert the selection, it's hidden, delete hidden. Okay, so now we only have a little bit left in there. This, since it's a little more finer detail, I'm going to use my masking brush. So if I just hold Control, I'm going to hold S to reduce the size. I'm going to paint this area in gray. There you go. And this saves my selection, so I can paint it like that. And you can be very careful here. I'm going a little bit fast, just so you can get this done. Okay, and then the last side here. And you find, if you find your brush is too small, you can also increase the size. Okay, great. Awesome. And if you want to take away your mask selection, I just hold Control and then hold Alt. You turn it to a minus sign, and I can reveal more areas like that. Good. So once everything is painted like that, or that I'm happy with, I'm going to press Control W, which actually assigns a separate polygroup between the two different differentiated sections. The mask space has its own polygroup, and now this Flask has its own polygroup, which means that if I go Control Shift and click on this model, and if you're still on lasso, I'll bring it back to select rectangle. Now that has disappeared, which is great, and the cropping is looking pretty good. I'm going to go delete hidden. Now for these little other remnants, these are probably vertices that I missed while I was painting it. Luckily, we have a little easy trick. We can go auto groups. You can find auto groups under polygroups and then auto groups. And it basically automatically assigns any floating pieces its own group. So then we're going to select the Flask again. Now it disappears all those floating pieces. We have a nice clean model, and I'm going to delete hidden again. All right, so all that part is cropped off. We do have these little bits sticking out, and we can just go back in here with the mask tool and just paint. And just paint those areas that need painting. And again, this is quite a complicated model to do this kind of cleanup for. But if you're able to do this, then you should have no problem with any of the models that are going to come that you have to do. Now, some of these polygons may be a little bit finicky. But for the most part, you just want to get it as close as possible. There you are. Good. So same thing, Control W will assign its own groups, and then I'm going to Control Shift and deleted part of what I wanted out. I'm going to delete hidden. Now there is this little bit here. This is a little bit tricky. I think I'm going to use my Select Lasso tool. It does a little bit of a better job. Yep. And then delete hidden. Okay. So that is good. And I do the same thing here. Just like that. Delete hidden. missed a little bit here. Sometimes you may have to go in a little bit more to capture those polygons. Is a little bit, it's not coming off. There you go. Okay, and then if there is some floating artifacts, you notice right here, instead of selecting that, I can just go auto groups, select rectangle and click on my Flask, disappears, delete, hidden. Okay, great. So now we have this gaping hole on the bottom. And luckily for ZBrush, we can use the close holes function, which I saved up here, but you can also find it in geometry, modified topology, and where is it? Close holes. There it is. Now, if you look down at the bottom, it closed up the hole really nicely, actually. And there is no texture information on here because it's a separate thing that we just created. And also an important thing to note about the closed holes is that when you use the closed holes, it will assign what, what it patched up as a separate polygroup. So if I were to Control Shift select this, this is its own polygroup here. And I can invert it and that's its own thing. So you can always go back if need be. Okay. And so so in this case, I might actually go back. So I feel like I missed an area here. So I'm going to isolate the original and I'm going to just delete the patched up holes that I had made because we can always go back. And I'm going to go to my lasso and clean up this a little bit. There you go. And delete hidden. Basically, the more jagged edges that you do clean up, you just get a little bit of a nicer operation with the close holes feature. So you just want to get it as close as possible. And yeah, for the purpose of this tutorial, I won't go for too long, hopefully, but this is already a lot better. Okay, good. Now we're going to do the close holes again, and you can see that the patching up is a little bit better. It looks a little bit nicer. Now, in particular, auto groups again. In particular, if a model is so difficult to patch up or it takes too long, usually this is already solved from the acquisition phase, the phase also where we scan and photograph the model. It usually cleans up this with our newer process. This is just in case if you come across models that are a little bit finicky like that. Okay. Okay. So it's just double checking. So now that's all patched up. That's looking great. Because the bottom doesn't have any texture information, we can actually paint it ourselves by using the color picker. So I'm going to untoggle Z add. I'm going to turn on MRGB. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically create our own texture. So we're going to hit new from Polypaint, which you can find. Oh, sorry. Not new from Polypaint. My bad. We're going to do Polypaint from texture. Okay. And you'll notice that the texture detail does go down quite a bit. If it does do that, right, this is a significant difference. A nice little cheap way that we can actually go about that is we're going to duplicate this model. So keep in mind, this is our optimized model, and I can rename it. This is optimized. And this is the model that we're going to actually adjust our texture on. Because when we're polypainting basically paints each polygon or vertex on the model. And so if we have a very low res model, then we won't be able to have as much texture detail as we have right now, right? And what we want, and we are creating our own texture. So we want to retain that as much as possible. So this is a duplicate of my optimized model. It's about 81,000 polygons. And it's because we cropped it quite a bit. I'm going to go down here to geometry, and I'm going to hit divide. Okay, and I'm going to do this a couple times, maybe get to 4, level 4. And now we're at about 3.8 million. It's a lot higher than what we started with, but this will ensure that we have enough textural detail transferred to our model. And we're not going to export this model at all. We're only using this to adjust the texture. So I'm going to go Polypaint from texture. You can see that there is still a little bit of a difference. So I'm going to Control Z, and I'm going to divide it maybe a couple more times just to get that textural quality at once. And every time you do divide, it is exponentially growing. So you want to be very careful. 5, I don't really want to go higher than 5. As you can see, it took a little bit longer. I'm going to just double check and see. Okay, it's a little bit blurrier. So probably only one more level should do it. I really don't recommend going higher than 6 or 5 for that matter. If you really need to, and that kind of textural detail is very important, then we can do it with that. So now it's at 6. And if we'll quickly check at what it looks like, we're about at, that is 62 million. So quite large, be careful. But now we're going to Polypaint from texture. And it's going to take a bit because there's a lot of polygons it's trying to go through. And finally, we can tell that it didn't make too much of a difference in the texture detail, which is fantastic. Okay, so now we have Z add off, we have mRGB highlighted on. There's a color picker here. And what we're going to do is we're going to click and drag here onto the color that we want. So I'm going to grab this yellow and I'm going to paint this base yellow, and it just uses the regular brush size. And it will tell you that because the ZBrush file is getting quite large, it's going to delete some undo history, which is totally fine. And we want to make sure that our texture here will actually turn off. We don't want that on. So then we're able to paint this, which is looking great. Fantastic. And this looks gray or the same color as this right now, but it is actually white. So I'm going to color pick that as well and color that in. There you are. And now again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but for tutorial's sake, this is quite good. So now we successfully patched that up. And let's say the part that you are covering up is actually quite complicated. Like let's say this pattern design is actually on the bottom and we want to recreate that. You can use the clone brush feature, which is something that's a little bit more complicated, but what you can do is go to Z plugin and projection master. And we're going to click on projection master and we're going to go just colors and drop now. And it'll save whatever view you're in, but you'll notice that you can't rotate around it. You can't do anything like that at all. You can't even move it. This basically gets converted as just like a 2D piece of paper to whatever view. So make sure that you get a good view where you can both see the pattern that you want to copy from and the area you want to copy to, right? And then from here, your tools would be different. I'm going to click on this, and there's a clone brush. And for the clone brush, it's the same thing as the clone brush in Photoshop, where if you hold Alt and I click on an area, or is it Control? Yes, if I hold Control, click on an area, then it will save that information and I can just paint away at it. Oh, there it is. Oh, and you want to make sure that you untoggle Z add. There you are. So I hold Control, sample it, and then I can paint the texture there. And I can repeat this pattern over and over. Once you're done, we just go pick up now, and it will basically transfer that texture onto your 3D model. It's going to take a little bit of time because we have a large model here. And again, be very careful. how large your model is. There we are. And now that's painted in. But since that's not really what we want, I'm just going to repaint that over. Make sure Z add is off. I just Control Z there. Okay. And mRGB is on. Great. And then I'm going to paint that over. Okay. So once you're happy with the way it looks, what we're going to do is we're going to hit New from Polypaint. And if I didn't go over it before, okay, that was when ZBrush was automatically auto-saving, but I don't want to auto-save because I have such a huge model, which might take a while. If I didn't go over it before, Polypaint from Texture is actually in here, Polypaint from Texture, that's what we did earlier. Now we're going to basically convert the Polypaint, so the actual color on the model, into its own texture file. And how we can do that is actually go into Texture Map, New from Polypaint. Okay, so when we do that, it's going to grab what we just painted everywhere and convert it to our model or to a separate texture map. There it is. Now that's being applied and that's looking great. We can actually clone this texture. So it'll be cloned and it'll be applied to here, which we're going to flip V because again, we're going to export it as a separate texture that we're going to use. And we're going to go to texture and export. And make sure that you export it as a .png. Okay, and you might want to export this texture file to wherever you're going to place your optimized model. So in here, in this case, I'm going to use the Flask. Okay, and I'm just going to overwrite this one. And that's going to export that. So that's for the texture. We're not going to use this model that's really high for the optimized model. So we're going to untick the eyeball here. We're going to go back to our optimized model. You can see the difference. And we're going to export this model. And this model is already optimized, right? So all we can do, again, very easy, just export the model. Make sure it's in Flask. I do have an example of it already, which is fantastic. And then I'm going to set it as version 2. And then I'll save. And then it's going to export only this model, whatever we have selected, as the model. And you want to make sure that you don't export this 62 million model file. Once you do that, just navigate to where your model is. Right. And you will see that it did create a .bmp, and we're just going to delete that because we don't need that. And this is the texture file that we created our own that's exported here, which is looking great. And the version that we have is version 2. We want to make sure that the .obj is supposed to be in lowercase, and we're going to make sure that we copy that name because when we open with the .mtl, it is in the BMP, so we want to replace that with our texture, and then we're going to overwrite and save. And that's it. And you just have to upload these 3 files to the model viewer, or you can zip these and upload it to Sketchfab. And that's about it.